I would like just to start this last session, and I'm aware there's a lot of competing interests here. There's coffee in one end and there's drinks in the other end. There's nice sunshine outside. So thank you for coming and listening. So my name is Olesen. I work for the EDCTP, which is the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership. And as you know, the area of global health is loaded with funny acronyms, and EDCTP is yet another one, and I'll throw in a few more as we go along. So first of all, what is the objective of the EDCTP for those of you who are not familiar with it? It is really to support the clinical development of new products for poverty-related and neglected infectious diseases, and specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. And before anybody asks what is then poverty-related and neglected infectious diseases, so in our definition, this really includes the three big HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis, which we consider the poverty-related diseases. And the neglected infectious diseases in our definition include the 17 diseases that are also on the WHO's list for neglected tropical diseases, minus Chagas, which of course is because we are predominantly working in sub-Saharan Africa. But instead we have thrown in diarrheal and lower respiratory diseases. So you can ask, what is the justification for actually setting up EDCTP, for putting public funding, taxpayers' money into supporting clinical trials in this area? And there are several, but I've highlighted a few of them here. One being that we've also heard previous today that there's very little interest from the private sector to undertake large, expensive clinical trials for products that maybe in the end has very little economic return. As we also heard from Jean-François earlier today, the public investments have been mainly driving this area of research, but we should keep in mind that actually the public investments are also relatively modest compared to many other disease areas. And what is more important maybe is that many of them are, at least in Europe, fragmented in different countries. There are small islands of expertise located in different areas, in different countries, different institutions, but there are many structural barriers between these islands of expertise, and therefore making it difficult to reach a critical mass, both with respect to funding but also with respect to know-how, because many of the diseases that we are talking about are actually scientifically very difficult to address. So the EDCTP actually started 10 years ago in 2003, and the first phase of the EDCTP will wrap up in 2015, and we are now in the second program, which was actually approved by the European Union 2 weeks ago only, and is going to start now in 2014 and run for 3 years. So as you can see, the EDCTP was set up 10 years ago when everybody was setting up public-private partnerships. But the EDCTP is actually a public partnership, because the main aim of the EDCTP is really to establish coordination and alignment of research activities between European countries and align that with African countries. So as you can see here, we are operating out of The Hague in the Netherlands, where we are an independent legal entity, and our aim is, as I mentioned before, to support the clinical trials of neglected and poverty-related diseases in sub-Saharan Africa. The way we're going to support this during the second program of EDCTP is through funding from the European Union of 683 million euro. This is cash funding coming from the European Union, and this will be matched by a similar amount, at least the same amount, from the European countries that are participating in the EDCTP. So while the European Union money is real cash money, then the funding coming from the European member states is a mix of in-kind and in-cash contribution. But on top of this, it's also our aim to leverage funding of at least 500 million euro from third-party participants in the area of EDCTP. So that would include industry, other funding organizations, NGOs, and similar organizations. This does not necessarily have to be channeled through the EDCTP, but through, for instance, coordinated funding of joint projects. So taken together, we sort of hope that within the space of EDCTP, we will have a financing volume of approximately 2 billion euro over the 10 years of the period where EDCTP2 will be active. And this will then be used for supporting clinical trials in Africa. So who is actually the owner of the EDCTP? And as it looks now, the current members are 14 European countries, which are marked in dark red here. But interestingly, also since 2 weeks ago, we also have 9 African countries signing up to become full members of the EDCTP. This is interesting because the membership provides some rights to sit and participate in the decision making and priority setting within the EDCTP. However, it also comes with obligations, financial obligations. So the African members that have signed up to become members of the EDCTP have also signed up to providing support to activities within the area of EDCTP. And those who can receive funding are all the European countries, all the member states of the European Union, and all countries of sub-Saharan Africa. So what we do is, as I've already alluded a bit to this, but this is really to support the full clinical trial pipeline. So ranging from phase 1 trials over phase 2 and 3 and until phase 4 clinical trials. Although we like to have an emphasis on phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials where we believe the need for funding is highest. The diseases we address, as I mentioned, are the poverty-related and neglected infectious diseases, and we support both diagnostics, vaccines, microbicides, and drugs, of course. But on top of supporting actual clinical trials, we support also a number of activities for what we call the enabling environment for clinical trials in Africa. This includes things like fellowships for young scientists, but also for senior scientists. It includes 4 regional networks of excellence that we are supporting, but also support to strengthening of the ethical committees and to the regulatory agencies in sub-Saharan Africa. Those of you who have experience with doing clinical trials in Africa will know that these are issues that are often missing or of a standard where it's really not up to international standards, and sometimes the processing is also very slow because the capacity is simply missing. So just have a quick look on what we have achieved in the first 10 years of operation of EDCTP. As you can see here, we have supported little less than 250 projects, and within those projects we have 259 institutions participating. Interestingly, if we break down who are the participants, we have about 2/3 of the participants are institutions in sub-Saharan Africa, and the last third is in Europe. And then we have a few other organizations also from outside Europe and Africa participating. The funding we have provided to the first program, which was only 200 million euro, has supported exactly 100 clinical trials, which of course is a nice round number. And we have supported also within those clinical trials 419 scientists through training different levels. And this activities has so far generated a little less than 500 publications. Not a huge amount, but keep in mind that clinical trials often only generate publications many years after they've been completed. And in addition to this, about 40% of the trials that we have supported are still ongoing. So we expect that the number of publications will grow to at least 1,500 over the next 3 years or so. If we look at the type of clinical trials that have been supported, you can see here that the emphasis is really on the phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. As you can see here, we have only supported in the first program HIV, malaria and tuberculosis clinical trials. But now that we are moving into the second phase, we will also include neglected infectious diseases. If we look at the type of clinical trials we have supported, you can see here that the majority of trials have been on drugs, with about 30% on vaccines, and we have a little less than 70% has gone to diagnostics, a little bit of microbicides, and then we have other types of activities that have been a mix on or pure capacity building activities. This does not necessarily reflect that we have a predominant focus on drugs, but more sort of number of candidates that were ready to go into clinical trials. But I believe we have a fairly balanced portfolio. Here's an interesting overview of where the clinical trials have actually taken place. And as you can see here, there's a clear bias towards Southern and Eastern Africa. So with South Africa, Tanzania and Zambia being the top 3 countries on this list. This of course reflects somehow the capacity of doing clinical trials that already existed in those countries. But I think what is interesting here is also that EDCTP has supported clinical trials in countries like Guinea and Namibia, and I believe, at least in the case of Guinea, we were actually the first. It was the first clinical trial that actually took place in Guinea. So there's also that element of capacity building, trying to elevate the standards in some countries that had never done clinical trials before to actually have the capacity to do so. Here is an example of one of the projects that we've supported, or actually a cluster of projects, namely the Panacea Consortium, which is aimed at undertaking clinical trials to develop a shortening of the TB treatment regimen. This consists of a total of 5 clinical trials, one focused on introducing moxifloxacin and shortening the treatment period from 6 to 4 months. Another trial testing the sequela compound SQ109, and we have 2 trials that is testing the effect of high doses of rifampicin, and finally the MAMS study, which is trying the combination of rifampicin in a high dose together with SQ109 and moxifloxacin. And these trials, as you can see here, are being undertaken at 20 clinical trial sites in Kenya, South Africa and Tanzania, but also include 8 European partners. Another example here is the GMZ2 vaccine candidate, which is a malaria vaccine candidate. Which is being undertaken at 4 clinical trial sites in Burkina Faso, Uganda, Gabon and Ghana, and has just been completed, and we are now eagerly waiting the results for the trial. So this is my last slide, and I just want to give you an introduction to how this funding mechanism of EDCTP2 is going to work. So briefly, the way we're going to work is that we're going to have an annual work program that is going to be published once a year, which will outline our activities, the call for proposals that we will have. And we expect that the first annual work plan of EDCTP2 will be published in July this year. We expect that we can support projects of up to 15 million euro, And the minimum criteria in the vast majority of the projects will be that at least 2 European research teams and at least 1 sub-Saharan African research team must participate in the project. In practice, in the vast majority of cases, there are many more partners, both in Europe and in Africa. We have 3 sort of funding streams, one with a fully funded funding stream, namely the integrated projects, which is projects that are selected and managed and implemented directly with 100% funding from the EDCTP Secretariat. Then we have another funding stream, which is where we will provide up to 1/3 of the funding for the trial, and the remaining 2/3 will need to be found among the European member states that are participating in EDCTP 2. And finally, we have a 3rd stream where we expect that we will, in most cases, fund up to about 25% in the trials cost, but with the remaining cost of the trials having to be found from other collaborators, such as other funders, industry, or other types of like-minded organizations. Thank you very much.